what makes the 2020 election different? The first is that the share of people who will be voting by mail will be twice what it was 4 years ago. Not everybody's going to be voting by mail, but we expect between 150 and 160 million people to vote in this election. And we expect that roughly 70 to 80 million of them will be voting by mail. 82, more than 82 million people have requested or are otherwise going to be mailed absentee ballots. What also makes this election different is that those ballots will be disproportionately from Democrats. And so there's never been before such a bias in the vote method that Democrats and Republicans have been using. In addition, as you can see right now, there is record early voting. So easily 60% of the ballots that will be cast in this election will be cast before Election Day. It could be as high as 75% of ballots will be cast before Election Day. So while most of the issues regarding reporting on this election focus on mail ballots, we also have to remember that you're still going to have, at least on Election Day, you're going to have 30 to 50 million people who will be voting by in person in polling places. And those polling places will be different. There are many polling places that have been taken out of commission because of the pandemic and they're no longer suitable. We will have larger voting centers. We will have long lines physically. That doesn't mean that there's congestion, but we know that if you space out voters by every 6 feet, that the line is going to be longer. There will probably be fewer Election Day voters, so that in some ways there's less reason for the kind of dysfunction that we might see. But everyone right now is quite thin-skinned, right? That we're living in an incredibly polarized political environment. People are looking for problems, and they're likely to react in very dramatic ways, specifically if it comes to issues of polling place violence or intimidation. All right. Let me talk about covering Election Day and then covering Election Night. Now, these are two sides of the same coin. So look, there are going to be problems on Election Day. There always are. There will be some places with long lines. We're already seeing it in the early voting centers. There are going to be machines that break down. There are going to be examples of poll workers who got COVID and then don't show up, right? One of the things that we're very concerned about, right, is that the traditional veteran poll workers are not volunteering this year because many of them are over the age of 60. The average poll worker in the United States is over 60. And so a whole group of novice and potentially less reliable poll workers will be taking their place. They will be inadequately, well, I don't want to say they're inadequately trained. There will be some jurisdictions where the training is going to be subpar because just like everybody else, in this economy, they're doing all of this virtually. And so it's going to be very difficult to train poll workers to deal with the problems that they're going to see on Election Day, both with respect to COVID and just in administering the election. And so we may see scuffles between voters, issues when voters are asked to wear masks, issues when voters refuse to wear masks and people in line are upset about that, as well as the issues that we've heard about concerning voter intimidation. The key question, I think, for reporters is not to focus on these isolated instances, but to see whether these are more systemic problems to a locality, right? Because like I said, just because there's one polling place with a long line doesn't mean that there's a systemic problem throughout the system. Okay, now after the polls close, and this is mainly what the topic today is about, what should you do, what shouldn't you do? Do not focus on the percent of precincts reporting. This is something that the networks have often done. It's not clear it's ever been the right way to report results. It's almost certainly not the right way to report results in this environment, and here's why. Many states will actually have one absentee ballot precinct in a county, right? So that it's not as if they count each one of the absentee ballots in the precinct and then report it as such. And so if you look at, you could have one precinct reporting, which would be the absentee ballot precinct in a county, and that could be half of the votes. Or you could have 90% of the precincts reporting, and that'll give a misrepresentation of the results because the absentee ballots were not included in those precincts. And every state and locality is different in this way. Do they report results, absentee ballots at the precinct level or at the county level? And so just get rid of the notion of precincts reporting. Similarly, you do not want to report decontextualized results. And what I mean by that is that you have to look at results given what we know about the absentee voter pool and the like. And so, if you know the fact that you have some votes that are coming in for President Trump or for Vice President Biden, for example, or even in the local races, does not those initial results are not necessarily predictive of the final results. And also, I think it's important that the media, even though they will project winners, there's nothing we can do to stop that, to not declare who has won a state, because election results on election night or even in the week after are always unofficial. That we should send the signal that what makes an election official is certification by the chief election officer in a state. All right, so if you can't do those things, what should you be doing? The first is, and this is hard to do, but if you prepare, you can do it. When talking about the votes that have come in, relate that to the total number of votes that are expected. So as I said before, precincts reporting is not terribly informative. But if you know that there are going to be 1 million votes in a jurisdiction and 500,000 votes have been counted, then you can say half the votes are taken in. Right now, that requires that you know something about the likely total number of votes in a particular jurisdiction. The local authorities will know some of that, as well as some modeling that, for example, if you look at a group called Citizens Data, they've been modeling this. Second, absolutely critical to report where the votes are coming from, both geographically and by mode. As I said before, knowing whether the absentee ballots have been counted in that first batch is quite important, and then where geographically in a state the results are coming from. And then the most important piece of information that you can give in order not to mislead voters is to report the results in 2020 as compared to 2016 in areas that have fully reported. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. We are going to have a lot of information on election night, right? And we are living in a very impatient society, and everyone's going to try to mine those nuggets of information for insights. But the key insight will be, how is President Trump doing it for the presidential election? How is President Trump doing as compared to 2016? Okay, and you will be able to get that sense from states which have nearly fully reported on election night. That will include Florida, by the way, or counties in any given state which have nearly fully reported. And then to see what President Trump's percentage is as compared to 2016. And then one can see whether there's been a kind of rising tide, either for the Republicans or the Democrats. All right. You've heard of the caricature of 2020 election, which what we call the red mirage and the blue wave, right? And the idea is that there's going to be a red, that because the election day vote will be more Republican than Democrat, then Donald Trump will have an advantage in the election day vote, which will cause a red mirage that then will be followed by highly Democratic absentee votes. Now, that may happen, but you actually may get a blue mirage at some point also, because there are states like Florida where at 7:30 on election night, they will report all of the mail votes that have been received at that point. So it's important for you to understand which states count votes when. So Arizona and Florida will have counted votes in the weeks prior to the election. Places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin will only be counting the ballots on election day or the day or shortly before. And so there's real risk that if we are in a close election scenario, and that would mean something like the 2016 election, that we're going to have to wait for election results. And so I think now it's quite important for you all to prepare for how you're going to deal with unwarranted claims of victory by one of the candidates, right? How to deal with foreign and domestic disinformation regarding things like destroyed votes or fraud or election official malfeasance in the vote counting process. It's important to amplify the voices of authoritative sources when it comes to the vote counting process. We have tried to do this at the Healthy Elections Project. You can see the specific work that we've done with videos of election officials that you can find at healthypolls.stanford.edu. But manage voter expectations as to when results will be available. It is too early to tell, even now, and certainly in the day after the election, what might be the issues that, for example, would lead to litigation. But it's important to, as I said, amplify the voices of the responsible folks, and then to make sure that you can focus on what might be the points of legal contention going forward. That's something I'm happy to talk about. You can get more information on this at our website, healthyelections.org, where you can see we have reports on each state, on mail voting, and research on everything from the current litigation to everything that will be happening on election day and before.
Start off with a couple of questions for you, Dr. Persily. So given the new Supreme Court, do you believe that our presidential election will be decided by the Supreme Court?
Well, the question about whether the election will end up at the Supreme Court, it depends on how close the election is. So it really just depends on whether it's close and whether there are legitimate legal issues. So look, if it's a close election and it's a replay of the 2000 presidential election where it comes down to 500 votes in one of the states, yes, I would expect the US Supreme Court to be quite involved. But that is a very rare event. Even in 2016, which was a close election, we didn't end up having it go to the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. And how can you find out which states are going to be counting ballots prior to election day?
Yes, the New York Times today actually has a graphic on precisely that, and then we will publish today a large spreadsheet with that information as well. As we're talking, I'll find the New York Times thing, and I'll put it in the chat.
There are lots of predictions about the final result. How close do you think these predictions will be to the final outcome, and what effect do you think these predictions are having on the actual voting?
Well, that's the second part I think is a really interesting question. And let me say two things. I have no special insight as to whether the polls are uniquely accurate or inaccurate this year. I can only say that a lot of these polling firms learned lessons from 2016 about how to do the voter modeling. I tend to think the election is much closer than people assume, but that's because I am a nervous person, and so I just tend to think that the idea that it could be an easy blowout election that goes against my personality, but that just depends on who you are. The second point, though, is a very interesting one, and I commend to you an article by several authors, one of whom is Solomon Messing, who makes the argument that the predictions of a Hillary Clinton, overwhelming Hillary Clinton victory in 2016 led some Democrats not to show up to vote. And so I think that is an important question to keep in mind, whether the existing predictions of Biden winning handily might have an adverse effect. Now, we are going to see an increase in voter turnout. We already know that. And there were roughly 135 million people who voted in the last election. There will be at least 15 million more people who turn out in this election. The question is, it could be 20. And so it doesn't seem like people are being prevented from going to the polls, but we don't know who's going to the polls. Although everybody's pointing to the absentee ballot requests and early voting as it's favoring Democrats, I would caution you against making predictions over the likely voter pool based off of the early and absentee voting.
How soon will we get an ethnic breakdown on the votes, if at all?
Well, so we'll get exit poll data on election night, but that's notoriously inaccurate. And so you'll get a good sense, though, in the 24 hours after the election from Edison Research who voted and what the share was. Some of that then gets corrected in the days afterwards and months afterwards, but you'll get some sense of how different racial minorities have voted in the day after.
Voter suppression. Are we looking at 2020 as a year when voter suppression is going to have a bigger impact than previous elections, or have we sort of met that demon and flattened it?
Well, it depends on what you mean by voter suppression. Now, and I know this is not a dodge, but it's a sort of plea for clarity also in the way that media talks about voter suppression. So there are certain things like the way that Florida has dealt with felon reenfranchisement, that Florida voters tried to, by law, reenfranchise all former felons, and now basically through decree in Florida, many of those felons are not going to be allowed to vote because they are saying that if they haven't paid their money that they owe for court, for different costs, then they're not able to vote. So that's an example. And you look at just the opinions in dealing with ballot drop boxes in Texas or witness signatures in South Carolina. There are rules in place right now that are restrictive for voting. And you heard yesterday about the Supreme Court's decision in over the Wisconsin case, which will not allow for ballots that were cast or that were received after the deadline in Wisconsin to be counted. So that's a description of the landscape. There is plenty of examples of where ballots are not going to be counted, even though the voters intended them to. Then there's the question of polling place practices and suppression in that regard. And while there's certainly, obviously, we have a rich history in the United States of voter suppression, particularly in Jim Crow South and the like, voter intimidation, even people being killed for trying to vote. It remains to be seen whether we will have some kind of unique system of voter intimidation in this election that we have not seen in recent elections on any grand scale. Obviously, the president and the president's son have talked about recruiting an army of election observers. We don't know what that means, and whether those folks will simply be observing the process or whether they'll be challenging the status of voters. And so we'll need to see. But remember, again, election day is going to be 1/4 or so of the vote. A lot of this, the kind of so-called vote suppression, might happen in the ballot counting process as well. And we need to be vigilant in keeping watch to make sure all the ballots that were cast early end up being counted.
Have you talked about this with mainstream media? Because mainstream media might be doing one thing and ethnic media might be doing another, based on your comments here.
Well, yeah, I'm the NBC News election analyst, so and PBS NewsHour, so that's pretty mainstream. So yeah, I'm talking to them.
I had a question about the impact of the narrative that the USPS will potentially be slow or might try to rig the election results. And so just what is the impact of mail-in ballots or mailers trying to mail their ballots, since there is such an influx this year?
Good question. So we don't know how many mail ballots will arrive late. We know it will be in the tens of thousands and probably hundreds of thousands. That would not be unique to this election. My guess is actually the pace of mail balloting and the time it will take for a voter who mails a ballot for then the election jurisdiction to receive it will be the same this year as it was in 2016. Now that is only that you can take that as good news or bad news, but that's because no one was reporting on the hundreds of thousands of mail ballots that didn't make it there on time in 2016. And so in 2020, we're going to have twice as many mail ballots, and so it's possible we could have twice as many ballots that are late. On the other hand, the campaigns are trying to mobilize their supporters and their voters to make sure that the ballots get there, are mailed earlier. But what I'll just say is that when you talk to the local postal officials, they feel that they've got this under control. And by control, meaning that if you mail it a week before the election, that it will be received in time for the election. Now, right now we're beyond that period, or today is the week before the election. And so, voters who haven't mailed their ballot yet should deliver it in person instead of putting it in the postal service. And one thing you should know, and reporters should know, is that roughly half of absentee ballots are not put into the postal service. They're either delivered by hand to election offices or polling places, or they're put in these kind of special ballot drop boxes. So when we call this vote by mail, but it means that the voter probably received the vote by mail. It doesn't necessarily mean they return it through the postal service.
How do you predict the Latino vote this time? Can we expect a massive assistance to the polls due to the aggressive immigration policies that Trump has put into place?
I don't. So from what I see in the data, I don't see either a large uptick in Latino participation or a significantly altered composition of support. Like it doesn't seem, for example, that there's going to be, massive shifts in Latino voting patterns. But we'll see. And of course, it depends on which area of the country we're talking in. Are you talking about Cuban Americans in Florida? Are you talking about Puerto Ricans and Americans in Puerto Ricans in Florida, like in the Orlando area? You're talking about Mexican Americans in Texas, right? I mean, you should expect Donald Trump to get about a quarter of the Latino vote. It just depends on where, and maybe more. Maybe he'll get more than that.
Sheree, do we know what country outside the U.S. most mail-in ballots will come from? I think that's a really important question.
It's a very good question, and I'm tempted. I'm going to assume it's Canada, but I don't know. And it really and that's just because you have to know where are there more Americans abroad than other countries, and so I'm assuming that maybe it'd be Canada. But I really the place to look is the U.S. Vote Foundation. I'm sure they have that data on their website.
When we talk about this as an historic election, going beyond who actually wins, having a record turnout, how do you think that will impact future elections?
Well, so I think the turnout will be, the number of people voting might be, certainly higher than 2016. I don't know whether, as a share of the eligible voter population, whether we're going to exceed, say, the 2008 Obama election. I think it's too soon to tell, because there are more people now, so we don't know what the percentages are going to be. I think that this election is going to fundamentally change our election infrastructure in a lot of ways. I think that the move to mail balloting is not one that's going to easily be reversed. Now that voters have become accustomed to voting in such a convenient way, there are going to be a lot of states that now they've purchased the equipment and trained their folks that they're going to say, all right, we're going to keep these rules in place. So I think that's sort of a major shift. The principal effect of this election will be who wins, whether Donald Trump wins or whether Joe Biden wins, and then who wins the Senate. And based on those results, you could see major reforms of the democratic process, just as you could see major reforms of the courts and other institutions. And so I think that this election has been instructive in kind of paving the way for certain types of democratic reforms in the next Congress.
We all know that there is a monopoly of information in this country. We all know that a few news outlets set up the news agenda for this country every day. So it's not going to be different when AP, Reuters, CNN, ABC control the information, and probably, as they do always, will announce the winner of the election. And probably it's going to be too early to be true. And I wonder if you have something to say about that.
So I think the Associated Press and Reuters are actually the most important actors in the description you just gave, because the AP sees its role as declaring winners. And you'll remember one of the things I said earlier on in the presentation is that I really think it's a mistake for any of these wire services to declare who is the winner. You can make projections. You can say, you can look at where things are going based on the fully reported data. But I think that's not the role of the Associated Press until the election officials actually have counted all the votes. So that's my general view. And I have an article in Slate on this that the AP has not been thrilled with me about. Having said all that, you're right that they play an outsized role, but the decision desks at each one of the networks also plays a really important role. Now, they rely on the Associated Press to a large extent because we don't have a kind of national election authority in this country that will oversee the dissemination of results. But the network decision desks, and let's say there are about 7 of them, right, are independent from each other. Not only are they independent from each other, they're actually independent from the news and opinion operations. So you might think that Fox News decision desk would be in line with the editorial stance of Fox. But I can tell you the decision desk at Fox is a very independent organization, very different than the folks who will be talking about the results. And so I think that's important. And also, one group you didn't mention is Facebook or Google. And so, I think Facebook plays a very important role. And I've spoken to them quite a bit about their voting information center. What they are going to do is to have a dashboard on election day and election night. They will be relying heavily on Reuters, but they will be putting up the calls from each one of the networks on their sites to try mainly to try to get after and combat disinformation that might be coming from official or unofficial sources.
Chuck Todd asked this of Corey Lewandowski on Meet the Press on Sunday. What state will you be watching on election night that for you will determine this race?
So it depends what time we're talking about. So this is what's important. So it's important in the Pennsylvania remains the tipping point state. It's the most important in a lot of ways. However, we are going to have a lot of information before Pennsylvania reports its results. And so the first state that I'm looking at is Florida, right? And so because if Joe Biden wins Florida, and we will know most of the results by midnight in Florida, then that game is over. Similarly, places like Maine and New Hampshire for President Trump, if he wins those, I think he wins the election. And so there are places before midnight on election night which will be very revelatory, right, very descriptive of where the election is going. That is Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, Ohio. Will all give us a good glimpse as to whether what world we live in. This is when I talk to reporters, this is the way I like to position it, which is by midnight on election night, we will know what world we live in. Do we live in a world which is going to come down to absentee ballots in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania? Or do we live in a world where there's a clear victor, right? Now, that doesn't mean the candidate that loses is going to concede early, but we will know based on the results that have come in, right, which will be over 90 million votes, right, which will have come in by the end of election night or by the next morning, which world we live in, whether it's one that's going to be a battle that will lead into extra innings, right, lead into overtime, or whether it's one where we can reliably predict who the winner is.
Thank you. Sandy, do you have any final questions? Or
can I, before Sandy jumps in, because Henrietta just asked a question here.
Oh, sure.
And I want to make sure that I respond to that so that that's not, so I'm not misunderstood. the point that I was trying to make is that there are going to be some states where you will have nearly complete results. Okay, and so those states are the ones to pay attention to, and those are the ones that I was listing before. If you look at the states where you're only going to have 50% of the votes counted, then you're right, that would not be predictive of the results. It's important to look at the states and the counties where you have nearly fully reported results, compare them to 2016, and then you can make predictions about who's likely to win.